I'm about to tell you something that will make you question every relationship advice you've ever heard. There's a phrase that destroyed my friend's marriage, and he didn't even know it was happening. By the time he realized what was going on, he'd completely vanished. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. Stay with me, because if you're married or planning to get married, you need to hear this before it's too late. What I'm about to share isn't just personal experience, it's backed by relationship psychology and years of observing patterns that silently destroy marriages from within. His name was James, 36 years old, corporate job, financially stable, good group of friends, normal guy living a normal life. When he met Lisa at a colleague's birthday party, everything seemed perfect. She was confident, articulate, emotionally intelligent, the kind of woman who could express exactly what she felt when she felt it. James loved that about her. He thought it showed maturity, emotional depth. He'd always believed healthy relationships needed effort. So when his married friends joked, "Happy wife, happy life, brother," he smiled and nodded. It sounded like practical wisdom, like a cheat code for a successful marriage. And honestly, for the first year, it seemed to work like magic. Whenever Lisa was stressed from work, James listened patiently. When she was disappointed about something, he adjusted his behavior. If his actions bothered her, he changed them immediately. Conflicts never escalated because he simply didn't let them. He apologized quickly. He compromised easily. He gave ground without hesitation, not because he was scared of her, but because he genuinely believed this was what mature love looked like. This was partnership. Every time he prevented an argument, the apartment felt peaceful. Every time he prioritized her emotional comfort over his own irritation, everything felt stable. And stability. That felt like success. Like he was doing marriage right. Here's the trap though. This isn't about control or manipulation. It starts as genuine care, as consideration, as love. That's why it's so dangerous. James convinced himself that keeping score was petty. Someone needed to be the stabilizer in the relationship. Someone needed to be the emotionally mature one. He just never noticed that this popular phrase never once mentioned his well-being. Think about it. Happy wife, happy life. It doesn't ask if the husband is thriving. Doesn't question if he feels valued or heard, doesn't wonder if he's content. It makes a quiet assumption that his purpose is to regulate her emotional world. The sacrifices started small and reasonable. Which movie they'd watch, whether weekends were too packed for his basketball games, which opinions weren't worth voicing during dinner conversations. He labeled these as normal relationship compromises. You have to be flexible in marriage, right? Everyone says that, and each time he adjusted himself, that phrase played in his head like a reward notification. See, you're doing it right. Keep going. But nobody tells you the crucial detail. This arrangement only functions when she's emotionally satisfied. There's absolutely no protocol for when she isn't. No guidance for when her happiness becomes inconsistent or unreachable. The phrase doesn't equip you for that reality. It just silently makes you responsible. And once you accept that responsibility, abandoning it feels like abandoning the marriage itself. James never noticed the exact moment when helpful advice transformed into unspoken obligation. These transitions don't come with announcements. They creep in gradually. And by the time you recognize the burden You've been carrying it for months. The shift happened in tone, not in events. There wasn't a dramatic fight he could point to. No obvious red flag moment. That's precisely what made it so insidious. It started with heightened awareness. James began monitoring Lisa's moods closely. The subtle change in her voice after difficult workdays. The particular silence that signaled disappointment. The specific sigh that meant something hadn't gone according to plan. He learned to read the atmosphere, not from anxiety, but from genuine care. If she seemed off, he'd ask gentle questions. If she appeared irritated, he'd soften his responses. If she went quiet, he'd fill the conversational space with lightness. It felt like emotional intelligence, like being an attentive, present husband, like doing exactly what modern relationships required. But slowly, something inverted. Her emotional state stopped being information he responded to. It became instruction he had to follow. If Lisa was unhappy, something required fixing, and that something was usually him. Never explicitly. She never said, "This is your fault." Instead, she'd say things like, "I just feel unsupported right now. I guess I expected more partnership. I thought marriage would feel safer than this." Nothing aggressive, nothing cruel, just heavy. So James adjusted his approach. He explained himself more carefully. Selected words that couldn't be misinterpreted. Let minor comments slide rather than risk. Lengthy discussions about why they bothered him. He started thinking 3 steps ahead. If I mention this, how will it land? If I suggest that, will it create tension? Will this comment ruin the whole evening? Avoidance replaced honesty, but it wore the mask of wisdom. He told himself this was maturity. Marriage isn't about winning arguments, right? It's about maintaining stability. And he learned that stability came from preventing her discomfort, especially hers. Over time, Lisa's happiness became the measuring stick for everything. If she was relaxed, the day was successful. If she was distant, something had failed. And James stopped asking himself a critical question without even realizing it. What do I actually feel about this? Because that question didn't help solve anything. It didn't restore calm. It didn't improve the household atmosphere. So it quietly disappeared. When he was exhausted, he pushed through. When he was frustrated, he reframed it as overreacting. When he felt disappointed, he swallowed it. There was always a justification ready. She had a harder day. She's more emotional. She needs support right now. And that phrase was always hovering in the background, validating the math. Happy wife, happy life. So if life felt tense, the solution was obvious. Fix her happiness. Adjust yourself. What James didn't recognize yet was the directional flow of responsibility. Her emotions were happening to her beyond her control. His reactions were happening because of him, within his control, she felt. He managed. That imbalance didn't register as unfair initially. It felt like leadership. Someone had to be steady. Someone had to absorb the emotional turbulence. He told himself that if he could just maintain smoothness, everything else would naturally work out. But smoothness requires a cost. It demands silence. It demands restraint. It demands shrinking anything that might disturb the surface. And without conscious awareness, James had accepted an unspoken rule nobody ever discussed openly. Her discomfort was urgent and required immediate attention. His discomfort was optional and could be postponed indefinitely. Once that rule embeds itself, it doesn't stay contained. It expands. James didn't invent this belief system. That's important to understand. He didn't wake up one morning and decide his happiness mattered less. He didn't consciously agree to disappear. The framework was already constructed when he entered marriage. Most men inherit this operating system long before they ever propose. They absorb it from uncles at family gatherings, from coworkers during lunch break, from older men who deliver it with a knowing laugh. Happy wife, happy life. It's usually packaged as humor, a harmless throwaway line you're supposed to chuckle at and move past. But jokes are how cultural programming bypasses critical thinking. When something's framed as comedy, you're not meant to analyze it. You're meant to accept it. James absorbed the underlying message without ever examining its foundation, that keeping peace was masculine strength, that disagreement was relationship poison, that a good man was flexible, accommodating, easy to live with, not weak, just cooperative, just mature. And nobody ever asked him the follow-up questions. What happens when she isn't happy despite your best efforts? What happens when her unhappiness has nothing to do with your actions? What happens when the standard becomes impossible to meet? Those questions never surface because the rule wasn't designed to be tested or questioned. It was designed to maintain surface-level smoothness. Men are rarely taught how to evaluate relationship advice critically. They're taught how to endure it, to tolerate difficulty, to adapt continuously, to carry emotional weight silently. So when James entered marriage, he wasn't choosing a philosophy. He was stepping into a pre-written role that culture had already scripted. The role says this: if there's tension, you fix it. If there's distance, you close it. If there's dissatisfaction, you compensate for it. Not because you caused it, but simply because you're there. Because you're the man. Because that's what men do. This is why so many men follow this pattern without resentment initially. It aligns perfectly with how they were conditioned growing up. Be useful. Be steady. Don't burden others with your emotions. That conditioning runs deep. So deep that when a man finally feels depleted, he doesn't think the rule is broken. He thinks he's failing at executing it properly. James didn't think this expectation is unfair. He thought, I must not be doing enough. I need to try harder. That's the brilliance of this system. It transforms structural imbalance into personal inadequacy. And because it's socially approved and constantly reinforced, there's no language available to challenge it. If a man complains, he's told, marriage is hard, man, or that's just how women are. You get used to it, or you knew what you signed up for. There's zero space to question whether the rule itself makes sense, because questioning it sounds selfish, entitled, immature, and men are taught early that selfishness is the worst possible trait in a relationship, so they comply. They comply quietly. They comply until their inner emotional world goes completely numb. And here's what makes this even more dangerous. The rule doesn't require cruelty to function. It doesn't demand manipulation. It works perfectly even when both people are well-intentioned and genuinely care about each other. Because the imbalance is baked into the structure itself. One person's emotional state becomes the reference point for the entire relationship. The other person becomes the regulator, and regulators never get to rest. James never felt oppressed or controlled. He felt responsible. And responsibility is an incredibly powerful leash. It keeps you working even when there's no finish line. It keeps you silent even when something inside you is desperately asking for air. This is why the phrase survives generation after generation. Not because it creates thriving marriages, but because it creates compliant ones, quiet ones, manageable ones, externally peaceful ones, even when the inside is slowly collapsing. James didn't wake up one morning and reject the rule. He just started noticing what it was actually costing him. And once you see that cost clearly, you can't unsee it. It didn't feel like losing himself. That's the part most men don't understand until years later. James didn't wake up one day feeling erased or diminished. He just felt quieter, less reactive, less opinionated. At first, it genuinely seemed like personal growth. He stopped pushing back on minor things, stopped correcting small details that didn't really matter in the grand scheme, stopped saying "I'd rather not" about plans or activities. Those moments weren't worth the friction they'd create. And each time he let something go, nothing bad happened. No argument erupted. No tension filled the room. No emotional fallout occurred. The apartment stayed calm. So he learned, not consciously, not deliberately, but the lesson embedded itself deep. Silence preserves peace. Soon, it wasn't just small things anymore. He stopped sharing half-formed thoughts that might need discussion, stopped bringing up ideas that would require negotiation, stopped voicing frustration in real time when it happened. He learned to process everything internally, to regulate his own emotions privately so he wouldn't disturb the relational balance. When friends asked how married life was treating him, he said all the right things. It's good, busy, but good, different, but that's normal, right? He believed it too, because nothing was wrong enough to justify real concern. But something was definitely changing. He noticed, he hesitated before speaking now, measured his tone carefully, filtered his humor through a mental screening process. He started editing himself before Lisa ever had a chance to react, not because she demanded it, but because he'd learned through pattern recognition which version of himself fit better into the household environment. The agreeable version, the low-friction version, the emotionally efficient version. Over time, his preferences didn't disappear. They just stopped surfacing. He didn't argue about weekend plans, didn't insist on his preferred approach, didn't challenge underlying assumptions. Not because he stopped caring, but because caring about his own preferences created tension. And tension threatened the one thing he'd somehow become responsible for maintaining, her happiness. He told himself this was just what men do when they mature. You settle down, you stop making everything about yourself. You grow up, but something subtle was happening beneath the surface that he couldn't quite name. He was no longer participating as an equal partner. He was adapting as a variable in an equation, constantly adjusting himself to keep the system stable. The more he adjusted, the easier things appeared on the outside, and the harder they felt on the inside. He couldn't explain the fatigue. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It wasn't work stress. It was the quiet, draining exhaustion of constant self-monitoring. Always checking his tone, always calibrating his response, always anticipating her potential reaction. That kind of vigilant awareness drains you silently, gradually. No one notices it happening, not even you. Until one day, James realized something deeply unsettling. He couldn't remember the last time he felt genuinely excited about anything. Not unhappy, not depressed, just muted, flat. Life was manageable, orderly, predictable, but completely flat. And the worst part, he didn't feel entitled to question it, because objectively, nothing was wrong. There was food in the fridge, bills were paid, nobody was yelling, no major crisis existed. This was success, wasn't it? This was what stable adult marriage looked like. But inside, he was getting smaller, not in one dramatic loss, but in hundreds of tiny concessions that never got counted or acknowledged. And once a man learns to live without taking up space, he forgets what it even felt like to occupy it. James didn't realize there was an unspoken rule until he accidentally tested it, not intentionally. He was just tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the deeper kind, the kind that accumulates from carrying something too long. One evening after a particularly exhausting week, he tried to explain it to Lisa. Nothing dramatic, no accusation. He just said he felt disconnected lately, that he was struggling with something he couldn't quite name, that something felt off inside him. He expected concern, curiosity, maybe even relief that he was finally opening up about his internal experience. Instead, the atmosphere changed, not immediately, but subtly. Her face tightened, her tone cooled. She didn't ask what he needed or how she could help. She told him how hard things had been for her recently, how stressful her work situation was, how his mood was making her feel unsafe and unsupported. The conversation pivoted without ever explicitly pivoting. Suddenly, his attempt at honesty was being framed as pressure, as emotional burden, as something he'd done poorly. He found himself apologizing, not for how he felt, but for bringing it up the wrong way, for choosing the wrong moment, for making her feel like she wasn't enough. The message crystallized, even though nobody stated it directly. His discomfort was disruptive. Hers was valid and required immediate attention. That was the rule. He tried again several months later. Different word, softer tone, more reassurance woven in. Same exact outcome. If he expressed frustration, he was being negative. If he expressed distance, he was withdrawing. If he expressed exhaustion, he needed to be more present. There was always a correction waiting, never a pause, never a moment where his inner world was explored with the same seriousness and care as hers had been explored countless times over time. James learned what happened when he spoke up about his own emotional experience. The household felt heavier. The mood shifted downward. The calm he'd worked so hard to maintain evaporated instantly, and restoring it became his responsibility once again. So he stopped testing the rule. He internalized it completely. Her happiness was the condition for peace. His was a complication that created problems. When people talk about emotional labor in relationships, they rarely mention this particular version, the kind where a man becomes the shock absorber for all relational tension, where his role is to absorb impact, smooth rough edges, and remain stable regardless of what's happening inside him. James wasn't being abused. He wasn't being overtly controlled. He was being managed by expectations he'd accepted willingly, expectations that seemed reasonable on the surface. That's precisely why it worked so effectively. He told himself this was just marriage. that long-term relationships weren't supposed to feel exciting or passionate, that fulfillment was a childish expectation, that stability mattered more than anything else. But something about the rule felt wrong. Not explosively wrong, quietly wrong, because there was no space for him to be human, only functional. And that phrase that started it all was always there, hovering in the mental background. Happy wife, happy life. There was no version that said happy marriage, shared responsibility. No version that said happy home, mutual care, just a single outcome and a single caretaker. By the time James realized the rule wasn't fair, he didn't know how to challenge it without destabilizing everything he'd built. So he didn't. He just got quieter. Nothing collapsed. That's crucial to understand. James's marriage didn't explode. There was no dramatic betrayal, no screaming matches, no moment where anyone could point and say that's where it all went wrong. It just hollowed out slowly, imperceptibly. The first thing he lost was desire. Not sexual desire initially, though that faded too eventually. Life desire. The urge to initiate anything, to plan, to build something new. It wasn't depression, it was disengagement. When every emotional risk feels like a potential liability, you stop taking them. When every authentic expression requires careful calibration, you stop expressing. James still showed up, still provided financially, still listened when Lisa talked, but he stopped leaning forward into life itself. And something else changed that he didn't expect. The more he sacrificed himself, the less respected he felt. Not openly, not cruelly, but subtly. His flexibility stopped being appreciated and started being expected as baseline. His patience stopped being valued and started being invisible. Standard operating procedure. He noticed that when he accommodated her preferences, it didn't bring them closer. It brought entitlement, an assumption that this was just how things work. And when he finally didn't accommodate something, when he hesitated, when he said no, when he showed fatigue, it was treated as failure, as if he'd broken an agreement he never remembered signing. The irony was painful to watch. The more he tried to maintain peace and happiness, the less attraction existed on both sides. Lisa felt less excited about the relationship, less engaged. James felt less seen, less like himself. Resentment grew quietly in both of them, but it had nowhere to go, because resentment requires belief in your own right to want things. And James had slowly unlearned that belief. He blamed himself for everything. If he felt disconnected, he assumed he wasn't trying hard enough. If he felt empty, he told himself this was just adulthood. If he felt unseen, he reminded himself that marriage wasn't supposed to be about him anyway. The phrase had done its work perfectly. Happy wife. If life felt dull and flat, the implication was obvious. He wasn't doing his job well enough. But here's the truth. Most men discover far too late. You cannot build genuine intimacy by erasing yourself. You cannot create attraction by becoming neutral and invisible. You cannot sustain a thriving relationship by turning one person into the caretaker of another adult's emotional world. James didn't lose his marriage in some dramatic, explosive way. He lost himself in it, gradually, quietly, and once that happens, nothing feels right anymore. Not staying, not leaving, not speaking, not staying silent. just existing in a role that no longer fits who you actually are. And the most dangerous part, from the outside looking in, everything still appeared fine, functional, normal. Let me be clear about something. This isn't about bad women, and it's not about marriage being a mistake. This is about a lie that sounds like wisdom, because it's repeated so constantly that nobody questions it anymore. Happy wife. Happy life doesn't describe a healthy relationship. It describes a transfer of responsibility from one adult to another. It quietly tells one adult that their emotional state is someone else's job to manage, and it tells the other adult that their role is to manage, absorb, and adjust no matter what it costs them personally. That isn't partnership. That's caretaking. Nobody can carry another person's happiness long-term without eventually collapsing under the weight, not because they're weak, but because happiness fundamentally doesn't work that way. A healthy marriage requires two people who can regulate their own emotions, two people who can tolerate discomfort without immediately assigning blame, two people who take responsibility for their own inner world. When one person becomes the emotional manager and the other becomes the emotional center that must be managed, resentment becomes inevitable. Attraction fades, respect erodes, connection becomes mechanical, and the man at the center of this situation, he's not angry now, he's reflective. He doesn't blame his wife for everything that happened. He doesn't see himself as a victim of some conspiracy. He sees something clearer now. He sees that he confused peace with silence. He sees that he confused love with compliance. He sees that he believed a phrase that never once asked if he was okay. That's the part nobody says out loud. A marriage where only one person's happiness truly matters isn't stable. It's fragile. Because the moment that happiness wavers for any reason, the entire structure shakes. And the man holding it up is expected to work harder, bend more, disappear further, until there's nothing left to give. The real truth is simple but uncomfortable. No adult is responsible for another adult's happiness. Support matters. Care matters. Effort matters, absolutely. But self-erasure is not love. If a relationship requires one person to shrink so the other can feel secure, it isn't healthy. It's unsustainable. James didn't learn this in some dramatic revelation. He learned it quietly, by realizing that the life he was living looked stable from the outside, but felt completely empty on the inside. And no phrase, no matter how popular or widely accepted, can make that a fair trade. A good marriage doesn't run on one person's emotional labor. It runs on shared responsibility, mutual accountability, and the freedom for both people to exist fully as themselves. Anything less than that eventually breaks someone, and more often than not, it's the man who was told his happiness didn't matter. The man who was told that his role was to manage, not to feel. Happy wife, happy life survives because it sounds peaceful. It promises order, stability, a clear path to avoid chaos. But what it actually creates is silence. It teaches men that harmony matters more than honesty, that their inner world is secondary, that if something feels wrong, the solution is to work harder, not speak clearer. And over time, that lesson rewires you completely. You stop asking what you want. You stop trusting discomfort as valuable information. You stop believing your emotional experience has legitimate weight, not because anyone explicitly tells you to, but because the system consistently rewards you for disappearing. This is how good men end up empty, still married, still functional, still providing, but completely disconnected from themselves. A healthy marriage does not require a man to vanish so someone else can feel secure. It requires two adults who can tolerate discomfort without assigning blame, to people who can take responsibility for their own happiness instead of outsourcing it, to people who choose each other not because one is managing the emotional climate, but because both are fully present inside it. If a relationship only works when one person stays small, it isn't love, it's containment. And the truth most men discover too late is this: you don't preserve a marriage by abandoning yourself. You only delay the moment when something finally breaks. Sometimes quietly, sometimes permanently. If this felt familiar while you were listening, don't rush to judge your relationship or make drastic decisions. Just notice what you've been carrying. Notice what you stopped saying. Notice what you stopped wanting. Notice how often peace came at the cost of your voice. Awareness is the beginning of correction, and that's where real change starts.